Thanks for checking out this fellowship message video. We pray it encourages you and draws you closer to Jesus. Also, don't forget to follow us online at @formacalm or at fellowshipchapel.net. It's the best way to stay connected to the life of the church.
My name is Robert, and I have the joy of being the lead pastor here at Fellowship. And today we're in week 2 of a series called Elevator Speech. And here's the premise of the series. How do we share our faith with others? Asking that question. And some of us might have different backgrounds or understandings of this, and I would even say that maybe even generationally we've had different backgrounds or experiences with this. There was a time when I was younger where the approach to evangelism, which is the Christian term for reaching out, sharing about our faith, was to go door to door and to give out these little cards called tracts. Maybe you've heard of them. And it was our opportunity to go. We rang a doorbell, we knocked on a door, and we gave someone a tract. And we said, here, read this, and it's going to share about the faith, the Jesus that we have. Well, now we have no solicitor signs everywhere. And we have ring doorbells, where if you ring it, it actually goes right onto your phone, and you're like, oh, who's at my door? All right, ignore you. And so those ways of doing it have, as our society have changed, have not been as effective because people aren't as receptive to a stranger coming and knocking on our door. What we see happen, and what we're going to continue to see in these next few weeks, is particularly looking at one of the first missionaries in the Bible, a man named Paul. He actually didn't go into someone and say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus right away. But he looked for an opportunity to have another opportunity. And so what he did in 30 seconds or less was bridge a gap, which we're going to see over the next 3 weeks. He bridged a gap, and then he stepped through the next opportunity to be able to share his story and what Jesus did in his life and how that could impact someone else's life. And so for the next 3 weeks, last week we looked at moments. We looked at how God gives us moments, times, life-changing moments. This week we're going to look at how we can address and talk to family members. Next week, we're going to look at how we can talk to strangers. And then in the final week, we're going to look at how do we actually give a message in such a way that gets to the root of our Christian faith. And my prayer is that no matter where you are in your walk with Jesus, by the end of this series, you will have the confidence to walk into your neighbors, your co-workers, your family, and have a confidence to share the faith. Because so often we think that we need to call or text Pastor Robert, and he can share the faith, because he is an experienced faith sharer. The reality is, throughout Scripture, what we see is, I'm no different than you. That we're all ministers of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And in fact, it's not up to the quote-unquote experts, but it's up to each and every one of us to be able to share our faith. And it's often much more simple than we ever make it. So I want you to think about your holiday get-together that's coming up. You're going to go home to your family members. And some of you are excited, but most of you are probably dreading it. And this is our family. I think of when I was living in Indiana, packing up the car and heading back to Michigan to come visit my family, only to then have to pack up again and probably leave for Ohio or Indiana or somewhere else where other family was. And we did this traveling to go see family. It was like a homecoming. This time where everyone could come together and we could celebrate the holiday season. But have you ever had that homecoming with your family that gets a little bit awkward way too quickly? Maybe with 2020 coming up, people start talking politics, and then all of a sudden the room is divided. Or people start talking religion in their faith, and all of a sudden the room is divided. Have you ever wondered why that happens? Why there is such a divide when it comes to topics, for instance, on who you're going to vote for, or the church you attend, or the faith you have? Even among your Christian family members, there is often divide based on the churches that you go to. Think about maybe your family members as you walk in and they've gone to a Catholic church their entire life. How dare you go to that fellowship chapel down the road? Or what about someone who's maybe in a different denomination or a different background? How dare you go to some other church? Why would you do that? What is different? Why can't you see our style of church versus your style? And those are the things that as we get together as families can be really, really awkward and challenging. And here's the simple reason why. Families all have traditions. And at some point, we all think that we're coming back to the same traditions. But when we realize that some of our traditions have changed, it kind of shakes the framework a little bit. It's like the first family member that votes the opposite political party of the family. They change the tradition. Maybe they were all of a certain workforce or a certain type and they all voted the same way. The same is with the church. Maybe they grew up all under the same understanding and the same type of churches or faith background, and you come home and something shook the tradition. And so now there seems to be a little tension. We're going to see as we dive in a little bit deeper. But what ends up happening is when this tension exists, when you and your family members might not see eye to eye, there's two things you can do. One, you can avoid talking about it. You can say, you know what, we will just get through this. We will have a nice ham. We will have turkey, whatever you're eating. We'll get through it, and then we will just go our separate ways. The second thing is you can talk about it. You can have a conversation about it. You can share about it. And oftentimes, we go back to option one because option two didn't go so well the last time. So then there's a third option. You can prepare for it, but don't force it. You can be prepared for an opportunity to share with someone without forcing the opportunity. Our theme verse for the whole series comes out of a letter of Peter. Now, Peter is one of the first followers of Jesus. He's the one who Jesus says, hey, Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Peter is the one who the Catholic faith would say was the first pope, the first father of the church. Peter is one of these early followers of Jesus, and he writes a letter. It's actually towards the end of the Bible, we find it, and he writes a couple, but one is called 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter, he writes this: if someone asks you about your faith as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Here's what's key to this passage. He doesn't say, go knock down someone's door and force your faith on them. He says, if someone asks, think about this for a second. Who does the initiating when there is someone asking? The other person. Their heart has to be in a place for the conversation. He doesn't say go knock down. Don't open up their heart. Don't go wreck everything to go have this conversation. He says no, when they ask. And then when they ask, you are supposed to have a 5-point answer with everything in line, right? No. He says be ready. Be ready. Be prepared to explain it. That's it. If someone asks, be ready to explain it. And so, we find that we don't need to force an opportunity with our family, with our friends. We don't need to force an opportunity. We simply need to be ready for one. And the question becomes, are we ready? See, if we force something, we have to strain for it. It's really hard. It's really taxing. But readiness is literally being prepared for the opportunity. And so the key to this series, the key for us as we begin going through this journey is for us to prepare ourselves so that we're ready to share something with others. Don't have to have all the answers as you're going to see, but we have to be ready for what opportunity God gives you. For instance, you could be at a family gathering, And someone might say to you, Robert, why do you go to church? Maybe you've been asked that question before. Why do you go to church? You know, there are a lot of things you could do on a Sunday morning. Like, come on, think about it. You work so hard all week long. You have to get up so early every single time. Why would you wake up early on a Sunday? Like, you could go out to eat. You could go just sleep in. You could be in your pajamas. Why would you go to church? And just thinking about that question, you don't have to say it aloud, but what would be your answer? Are you ready to answer that question? Well, my mom makes me go to church, so I go. Is that your answer? That was my answer for quite a bit of time in my life journey. Well, it's something I've always done. Why do you go to church? I like the music. I really don't like the music at our church, but I love Robert's preaching. It is the bomb. These are those answers that we might think or say, but is it really the root of why we go to church? Why do we? Oh, the music, it just makes me feel so good. These are all reasons that we could use, but here's the key takeaway. Here's the reason that we would answer that question the way we would. Why do I go to church? Why am I a follower of Jesus? Here is the simple answer that we're going to see Paul did and what we can do, especially when talking to our family members. Are you ready for it? It's revolutionary. It's life-changing. It's called sharing your story. This is how God interacted in my life. And this is how God moved in my life. And let me tell you about the difference it's making in my life. Your story. This is who I was. This is how God has been working and moving in me. And this is who I'm becoming. And look at this. It's so awesome that God is changing me in such a positive way that now I can't help but want more of Him. I share this all the time with friends and neighbors. I say to them, you know, there was a time where if you saw me, you would say, you're going to be a pastor? Really? Like a pastor? A pastor. There were times when in my life I made some decisions that I would say if you knew about them, you'd be like, oh, really? He's our pastor? But God used a broken individual like me. He put people in my life. He put mentors around me. He showed me over and over again His love for me. He put me in churches where I could grow and I could understand more of Him. And what ends up happening in my life? I can't help but want to talk about what God's done to me. He's given me hope in hopeless situations over and over and over again. That's why I love talking about the struggles I've had to go through. The times when our children, in their ultrasounds, it didn't look so good and we had to face some really tough decisions. But God came through. How in times of loss and grief and losing those close with me, I mean, by the age I was 23 years old, I had already lost 4 friends from the time I graduated high school. And being able to see how God just worked through that to give me opportunities to share His love with friends around me. It's those kind of things where in those times of grief and despair, those times where maybe you were out of a job, but God still provided for you. That's the stories that we can share over and over again. Share your story. And so let's look at what Paul did to give us a real good understanding of his approach, especially with those close to him. So we're going to be in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 21, verse 17 is where we're going to start. If you're using one of the chair Bibles, it's page 797. You can pull out the YouVersion Bible app. I know I sound like I'm trying to buy stock in this app. It's just because I use it all the time, and it's actually a church created it, and they give it out for free. So how awesome is that? So if you want to do the YouVersion Bible app or even just Google it as a starting point, we're going to be in Acts chapter 21, starting in verse 17. And as you turn there, I'm going to give you some background to this text. The person who we're going to see and what he does is Paul. We talk about him quite a bit. And Paul is coming back from his third missionary journey. Now we're talking someone who literally through his missionary journeys, we see he faced shipwrecks, he faced imprisonments, he faced times where he was even stoned. He goes from town to town throughout the world, and he sees and he shares with these people who have no Jewish or understanding of the way, Jesus, and he shares his faith, and churches are started. And so he goes and he encourages these churches, and he helps boost them up and help them to be able to reach the people around them. And so he travels all through what we know as Turkey, modern-day Greece, all around that Aegean, Mediterranean Sea area. And he goes place to place, and he does it 3 times. He goes on 3 missionary journeys. Now what's key for us to understand is that Paul was a very, very devout Jew. Jesus was Jewish. He comes out of a Jewish family. Christianity comes out of Judaism. And so Paul, was very Jewish, studied under some of the greatest Jewish teachers. And then what we're going to see is he has an encounter with Jesus that changes his life, changes his perspective, changes everything. And he's so on fire for Jesus that he goes around, and from a time where he persecuted, literally killed Christians, followers of Jesus, he now is a missionary sharing about Jesus. Now I want you to think about this from his Jewish family perspective. He is a rebel. He is one who has completely changed his life. He's left his family, he's left everyone, he's left his traditions behind, and now he's out talking to people who are not Jewish. And he's sharing about this Jesus with people who were the ones who persecuted Jesus and don't believe that Jesus is truly who he says he is. So Paul is going to come back to Jerusalem. And this is what we see happen if we read the first few verses starting in verse 17. When we had come to Jerusalem, side note, it's interesting that it says we. This gives us insight that Luke, who wrote Acts, was actually with him. So that's intriguing, just like those little tidbits. The brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James. Now, James is the stepbrother of Jesus. So he goes to James, Jesus' stepbrother, who actually is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. He was sharing stories. This is how God worked. This is how God moved. These are the cool things that we saw happening. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews who have believed." See this? Look, here in Jerusalem, there are even thousands who were Jewish who now believe in Jesus, just like the Gentiles. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. This is what's important about this verse, verse 21. This is the rumor on the street about you, Paul. All those traditions that we followed, those laws of Moses that we hold so true and dear to us, all that you did, you know all those Jewish teachings, all of that, rumor on the street has it that you're going against them. That in fact, you're actually saying, you know what? Forget the law of Moses. It's all about this Jesus. And people are really confused, and they actually, as we're going to see, really don't like you. They're upset about this. There's a rumor on the street about you, Paul. Maybe you've had that as you came to the family gathering. There's a rumor on the street about you. There's a rumor that something changed in your life. There's a rumor that something happened. There's a rumor that now on Facebook, all of a sudden you have pictures of you at church. What changed? What happened? It goes on. What then is to be done is the question. They will certainly hear that you have come. Just think about that for a second. What are we to do about it? Something's going to happen. It goes on. Verse 23. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance with the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and blood, and from the sexual immorality. So this is what they're saying. Here's the takeaway. They're telling him, hey, Paul, respect the traditions. Respect them. Respect another's traditions. When he comes back, there's a couple things that are really interesting in it. The first is that we see Paul is being told, hey, look, we have these Jewish men. How about as a way to show the Jews around us that you actually respect the traditions, take them with you, go purify yourselves, go through this 7-day tradition of purifying yourselves. And then they will see that you actually uphold our Jewish traditions. Go do it. Here's a simple way to put it for you. If grandma doesn't like you to wear shoes in the house, take them off. Have you ever been to someone's house and you don't know, do I wear my shoes? Do I not wear my shoes? I'm barefoot. What do I do in that case? Maybe you bring a pair of slippers just in case because, you just want to honor these little traditions, and that's really small, but think about it. You walk into someone's home, what are their traditions? What are their ways of doing things? And they're saying, look, Paul, just observe what they do. Practice what they practice. And what's interesting is that last verse we read actually shows that he didn't have to do it. James and the elders had made a decision. They wrote a letter that, look, the Gentiles, those new believers, they don't actually need to practice these traditions. But you, Paul, as a Jew, you should. Because you have to understand where you come from. Here's what goes on. Verse 26. Then Paul took these men, he takes them, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, and giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and an offering presented from each one of them. What Paul does is he goes and out of respect purifies himself. He didn't have to, but he did it because he was bridging a gap with family members. What we're going to see next is what's so shocking. Because sometimes we can go back to our family. We can respect the traditions. I want you to think of it from this standpoint with me. A lot of times there's age-old traditions that have been passed down through the family for years and years and years. For instance, growing up Thanksgiving, my grandma made this cranberry thing with cranberry and oranges and all this stuff in it. And it was horrible, like absolutely horrible. But it was grandma's cranberry, and she said it was the best cranberry because her grandma made it, and her grandma made it, and it's been passed down through all these generations. And so I'll never forget being a kid and my parents looking at me, you take your no thank you bite, okay? You just take the no thank you bite, and everyone would pass this little cranberry, and they take this little tiny dab of it, and then eventually grandma had a whole bowl left of cranberry, but we all actually ate it. We respected the traditions. Sometimes we respect the traditions, we come home, but yet we still get persecuted for whatever reason. In fact, right now, in this exact moment, there are over 250 million Christians who face the reality of persecution right this very moment. 250 million Christians who face the reality of persecution. And you know the number one place that they're persecuted? When they go back home. It's someone in India who converted from Hinduism, and now they're going to go back to grandma or grandpa's, and their faith is so much deeper than our faith walk here in America often, that their faith is literally everything. And how dare they have give up on Hinduism? And now they're going to face beatings and persecution because of their change of faith. If we look at open doors, you will find that in the top 10 countries where persecution is a reality, It's often what's called for homecomings, when a new believer goes home for the first time having known their faith. We partner with a missionary named Diane Frank who reaches out to Muslim men and women in Dearborn, right down our road. And she'll share stories about how women will come to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior through this ministry, but then they have to hide them somewhere else in the country for their own safety. In fact, she shared a story about how someone was going up and down I-75 with pictures of these recently converted girls saying, "If you find them, let us know." Sometimes the reality is people in their faith, it's not just seeing a little bit of disunity in it, but there's a whole lot of persecution that comes from it. So what happens with Paul? This is what is intriguing to me. Paul understood something that we have to understand: respect a tradition, and then recognize someone's predisposition. How are they coming into the conversation? Because look at what happens to Paul. Verse 27, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple. Did he speak a word yet? Nope. Did he say anything? No. Did he do anything? No, he was actually just upholding their traditions. But they saw Paul in the temple, and what did they do? They stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. It goes on, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." Verse 30, then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. Verse 31, and as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune. Just capture this. Did Paul say a thing? Did Paul do anything but follow their traditions? No. But they already had a predisposition towards Paul. They were seeking to kill him. And so what does Paul do in this moment? We might not be sought after to be killed by family members or those close with us. I would hope not. But they're coming after us with some type of predisposition, some type of thought of what happened in our life. And they might come a little agitated. Maybe that's been your family with politics. I see this a little too often in our world. Don't tell your family member who you voted for because they're going to prejudge you or look at you based on which way you voted. That can happen in our faith as well. And so what happens with Paul? Well, like we're going to see throughout this series, he responds to an opportunity. Look at verse 37 with me. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune. Now you have to understand, he's been arrested. The tribune, the leader of the city, non-religious but governmental leader, is now involved because of the riot that was stirred up because Paul returned. And this is what he says, and this is the question that we have to understand as we look at having conversations with others. He says this, "May I say something to you? May I say something to you?" This is a loaded statement for a couple reasons. Think about being held in chains, being guilty before ever being proven innocent, like he's basically looked at as guilty, wrong, in the wrong, and all of a sudden people are pointing their fingers and they're saying, look at how horrible he is. They've already been predisposed to what he did, and he doesn't defend himself. He doesn't say, look, I have to say something. I have a right to speak up. He asks a question, may I say something to you? And this is what's so revolutionary about it when you have conversations with others. When you ask a question, you disarm them. Because every single person wants to control the situation. They want to have the upper hand. And so what ends up happening is when we ask a question, it gives them control to respond. may I say something to you? He's now giving the opportunity for a yes or a no. He's not saying I have to. He says, may I? And so, of course, he gets an opportunity.
And then what happens? He shares a 5-point
outline of his faith. He gives them a track. He says, actually, may I say something to you? Let me pull out this track. It's actually on a tablet. Here you go. Here's my faith. What does he do? He shares his story. He owns it. Of all the things Paul could say to people in a riot, what does he say? His story. And so as we close, I want you to hear Paul's story. And your story, I'm sure, is not quite like Paul's, but there's something about your story that you could relate to Paul's story. And so here goes his story, starting in verse 40 of chapter 21, and we'll read it through. And when he had given them permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hands to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew, born of Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as you are to this day. I persecuted this way. I persecuted these Christians to death. I killed them, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. If somewhere in your story you feel it's a little too dark for God, think about Paul, who literally killed God's people. He starts there. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. I went to the city Damascus, and I was going to kill them too. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. I fell to the ground. He had his rock bottom moment in life. Maybe you've had a rock bottom moment where you've just fallen to the ground. You've been broken. Only, as Paul would see, to discover that at the very bottom was the rock that it was holding you up and taking you to the next step in life. I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you doing what you're doing? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all this is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand of those who were with me and came into Damascus. And one, Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear the voice of his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell in a trance and saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching of the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. I think you'd expect him to share his story, and all of a sudden it was received with openness. Oh, wow, Paul, that's so powerful. No, they said, Paul, we're ready to kill you still. But here's what we can learn from it. This is not something that, this is me giving my own interpretation, not from, like, thou said God, but here it is. Can you imagine Jesus, life, he dies, he rises, he ascends to God the Father in heaven. And God says, you know what? I still have one more thing to do, Jesus. See this murderer? See the one who's actually killing me? My people? I want you to go and visit him. I want you to change his life so that he would have a hope that would go beyond anything he faces on this earth. And oh, by the way, over 2,000 years later, we're going to look to this killer of Christians. We're going to see the change that happened in his life, and that story is going to be a story that motivates billions of Christians throughout the world. That's what we're doing today. So whatever your story is, don't be ashamed of it. Own it. Because that's what Paul did. He didn't care the outcome. He owned his story. There's something about each and every one of us that we have, and it's called our story. I was moved because we had a week of prayer this week, and we had cards where we literally prayed over names of friends and family members who are far from Jesus. And we went through as grandmothers and parents and brothers and sisters and children and aunts and uncles. And we prayed for each and every one of these family members. And so here's my challenge for us, church. As we go into our family gatherings this year, share your story. Be prepared. And in order to do that, start by writing it down. So this week, where has God moved in your life? What has he delivered you out of? And how can you own it in such a way to share with those you love? Will you pray with me? God, thank you for working in our lives, for giving us the story that you've given us. May we take hold of that, may we own it, and may we use it to glorify you, God. God, give us a confidence to talk about how you've moved in our lives, how you've worked in our lives, how you have delivered us from our pits, whether it be pits of depression, pits of addiction, pits of anger or rage, pits of pride. God, where we have been delivered from, would we just own that, and would we have a confidence of how you use us despite our shortcomings, and with that encourage others that no matter what their story is, you have a plan for them. In your name we pray.